Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. We promise, we're running slightly late, but we promise not to interfere with your coffee break too much. You will get your coffee break. And I'm here to introduce the four speakers. I'll introduce them, and then we ask them to make a few brief points, and then we go straight into discussion. If we get a chance, I'd love to get one or two questions or observations from the floor. So I'm going to call first on Professor Jan Palmowski. He's a Secretary General of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities. He's an historian by training, and we'd like to know a little bit what your observations that you make about the state of European higher education.
I think maybe moving on from the theme just enunciated, I think that we are, that there are many discussions really about great transformative change going on right now, but I also really see real warning signs. We've just heard about the example of the Netherlands, and I think there's a real disconnect in the thinking of a growing number of governments who are really trying to hem in the number of the number of international students coming. At the same time, they're increasingly worried about international interference, and they're worried about certain students from certain countries being on certain courses that are sensitive. And yet universities find it increasingly difficult to really then also populate and grow the number of students in really sensitive and important areas for us, like artificial intelligence and so forth. So I think we need much more joined up thinking in Europe about how we're going to do this. We need much more investment. We heard earlier the Ireland as the home of many of these great tech companies, but I would argue that they're not here. They're here primarily because of the tax breaks of the Irish government, and not because of the investment of Ireland in its universities, because that has actually gone down in real terms, both in terms of the number of students, in proportion of the number of students, and also in proportion of GDP. And I think that's unacceptable, and I think that's a kind of model that's not sustainable across Europe. Maybe I'll just leave it with those 2 points. Yeah,
thank you. I'm sure the Irish universities will certainly echo that complaint about the inadequate funding, but they are very successful despite that inadequate funding. Yes. And as was said at the opening by our friend from the University of Limerick, Nigel, they're all universities, the traditional universities are in the top 5%, which is to their credit. I'm going to call on Chiara Finocchietti, if I pronounce it correctly, who's from CIMEA NARIC in Italy. She's an expert on the evaluation of qualifications and higher education systems. So you might just make a few brief observations.
Yes, thanks. I can recall on what has been said. Mobility is growing, as Dr. Janet Ilieva said, and also we see a lot of let's say, a lot of students that would like to come to Europe, and a lot of work on recognizing this qualification. Of course, internationalization bring with itself a lot of challenges, and one is for a higher education institution, for university to be gate opener. We heard about conflicts. I mean, we are used to think to international students as students that decide to move, to improve their education, but actually we are seeing more and more forced mobility. So in this sense, higher education institution can act as a gate opener, so allow people that are forced to move to access to higher education, for instance, refugees, and to support them even in cases where their educational documentation is missing, to help them to access higher education and also to succeed, because this is another important part of the story. And on the other side, internationalization brings also challenges like more education fraud, document fraud, and in this sense, universities are also called to be gatekeeper, to really support quality mobility and quality students to move.
Yeah. Thank you, Chiara. I'm glad you mentioned refugees, because they're often overlooked in the discussions about student mobility. I'm going to call on a fellow Irishman, Dr. Conor O'Carroll. He's a director of SciPol, but he's particularly interested in the career development of young researchers. So you might like to make a few observations.
Thanks, John. And I'd like to come back to, in fact, the challenge that was set this morning by earlier speakers, in particular that of taking the perspective of the student. Or indeed, as I tend to focus in the area of doctoral training and researcher mobility. And when you look at globally that the numbers of researchers has expanded dramatically from 2007 to 2015 by over 20%, up to 7.5 million, and by a further almost 14% between 15 and 18. It's a continuing expansion. And within that, you have, in particular within Europe, over 650,000 doctoral candidates. And they are, I think, one of the big advantages, as was pointed out by earlier on, is that the openness of Europe in terms of mobility, because one of the principles of European research area policy is a single market for the movement of knowledge and people. And this has been highly effective in having mobility between countries, but also from outside of Europe into Europe as well. This brings great benefits. There are many, many challenges involved. There is no doubt about that. But I think that there are also new developments which I think look really good in terms of, the point that Jan brought up about interference in academic freedom, for example, has been and is an issue within Europe. But a common European policy is currently under development to deal with this issue and to challenge it and to bring something far more positive into this realm. I think in terms of mobility, one always thinks as well as international mobility. But the challenge for PhDs is that the majority of them will never have a job, neither in academia nor in the research sector itself. So their challenge is, what do they do next? Now, all of them, in fact, remember that the global unemployment rate for PhD graduates is less than 2%. So it's a pretty good path to go on. But often people go on it mindlessly rather than mindfully, in that they think, they only start thinking about what they're going to do next towards the end. And therefore, the new focus on mobility between sectors, on the ability of people to move out of the academic into other sectors, which are the majority of employers for brings in training and brings in the recognition of qualifications, which very recently has been done here in terms of micro-credentials for researchers, recognizing the skills they gain. Because for researchers, what people often fail to realize, indeed they themselves, the skills they obtain as researchers are highly valuable in the outside environment of working in teams, being able to lead, being able to think critically. So I think I accept the challenges, but I think the future is good.
Yeah, good. That's an optimistic note. And very useful points that you're making there, particularly about mobility into other areas, and acquiring micro-credentials to help that progress. Finally, we're going to call on Janet. You've already heard Janet speak very well already, and I know she's further interested in global engagement and sustainable development. So you might like to make a few points, opening points.
Thank you. I think that the past few years have presented a huge challenge to educators globally. And while the mobility of students continued to expand, we also have to focus on things that are not necessarily quantifiable. And I'm talking here about the student success, ensuring that students continue, they stay on their course, they don't drop out, they get the best possible outcomes from their education, and they get good jobs when they finish their training. So these levels of support we need to be a little bit more mindful about, and the expansion of higher education has not necessarily gone hand in hand with increased support for those students. So I think that there is a little bit of recalibrating there that needs to be done. And I would also like to pick on what Chiara mentioned about is the mobility of students, but equally is the mobility of programs. And during the pandemic, universities have actually done a tremendous job in enabling academic programs to reach students in remote locations. And we became a little bit more connected with students' needs, with their locality, the varied places that they come from, and the whole feeling of sustainable development and looking out for each other, I think, has become much more prominent. And this is quite an optimistic note, I think, about the purpose of education. it is to widen opportunities, it is to reach learners, irrespective of their age, irrespective of their location, reach them where they are and to connect with them. And this is where sustainability comes as I think, as a thread throughout the education delivery, the life cycle of the course, and connecting it again back to the students' locations and the jobs that they aspire to do.
Thank you. And I think we might come back to that question of supports for students who come into universities from overseas in particular. But before we do, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do though is just raise one issue that we haven't touched on yet, but concerns every academic, every institution across the globe, and that's generative AI and the impact it will have, or is having already, with ChatGPT and so forth. And I can mention just two stories that appeared recently. One was the BBC had a story about a student who was telling his teacher of Spanish that he now had a chatbot who was able to correct his grammar, give correct pronunciations in the various dialects, including Mexican Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, and Spanglish. The teacher, of course, was wondering, would this mean redundancy, and was partly reassured by the student's statement that he still needed that human interaction. The second was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education in which they had a quote in big black letters saying, and I'm sure our American friends won't agree with this, the silence about AI on campus is shocking. Nationwide college administrators don't seem to fathom just how existential AI is to higher education. So I'm going to push that just a little bit further and ask the obvious question, is there an existentialist threat to higher education institutions in the future because of AI? Or will they adapt sufficiently and rapidly to the ever-changing and accelerating changing world of AI? Anybody like to take up that easy question? Yeah.
I'm happy to
Heather, do please
start.
start.
Well, I think where I would see the challenge is the challenge to the student learning. Because part of education, yes, is learning and understanding the body of existing knowledge, but it's also learning how to think critically and challenge that body of knowledge. And this is where AI is actually a real problem, because systems like ChatGPT will give you the bland.
Yeah.
And they do not challenge. Also, when I look at, say, PhDs who are struggling to publish papers, to do that, in a system currently where there's a plethora of paper mills, false publications, false conferences, it is very hard for them to deal with that. AI will increase that because it will allow automatic journal editing, peer review, etc. I mean, they're the downsides. Now, there are pluses. I mean, you've always got to balance these things. I use two particular AI tools, SciSpace and ResearchRabbit. They're both very good. ResearchRabbit, for example, allows you to identify papers and similar papers in the field you're working in, to identify the authors, to get very good networking maps and that of what's going on in the field. So used with caution, used with intelligence, it can be really good. From the point of view of researchers, AI in the lab is highly valuable for medical diagnostics. It's used in gravitational wave detection. It also has been used, in fact, it was Alphabet, Google's company, who used it with their DeepMind AI learning program to solve the problem of protein folding. So yes, but it's got to be, it has real potential, but there is a real danger that it will dumb down the ability of students to learn.
And how do universities respond to that? That danger of dumbing down? Yeah.
So first of all, I mean, you asked at the outset, will they adapt? The answer is yes. Will they adapt quickly enough? I'm not so sure, because this is going very, very fast, and our quality assurance processes, I mean, there's a huge challenge in that for them. But I do think that the wider question is indeed the issue of how our subjects transform through AI. And to my mind, this requires a new, not just a new kind of pedagogy, but also, you know, there's a fundamental challenge that we need to deepen our students' learning and understanding in specific subjects that are about, many of which are about to undergo, if they haven't undergone them already, they're about to undergo a fundamental scientific revolution. So you need to deepen their expertise, while at the same time you also need to broaden their transferable skill, while at the same time they also need to earn to make a living. And this is an extremely difficult triad of challenges around students' time. That is a massive, massive challenge, I think, for every institutions, but I think they really do need to be faced.
But this can't be done in isolation from what's happening in secondary or high schools. Would anyone like to take up that point about the need for change in secondary schools as well?
Maybe.
Yeah, please.
Maybe I can add, I mean, not really on the secondary school, but more in general, bring another layer of complexity on the topic of AI, looking to AI from a mobility point of view.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we think about technology in general, we really think about, it's like the Roman god, Janus, with two faces. And one phase is that, of course, technological development more in general is always a problem, part of the problem. It makes it easier to cheat, to forge documents. On the other side, it could be also an important part of the solution in supporting mobility, automatizing processes of recognition, of assessing qualification, for instance, supporting easy and secure digital student data exchange. So let's say, we can say that techniques is not ethics. So it's very much to us to understand if and to what extent also AI can support a quality education. And of course, this can be done only if it is at the service of a clear vision and a clear strategy. And then, of course, this will be still to be explored, to what extent we can control AI, and this is another part of the story. But there is this tension in technological development.
Yeah, indeed. Just on the general question though, student mobility, it seems to have rebounded in terms of the numbers wanting to go to other countries. But is everything, as they would say, hunky-dory? Is everything fine again? Do we have anything to worry about? I think you had raised the point about the numbers of students who in Europe who just go to another country. Do you want to pursue that point? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's basically quite interesting, slightly dramatic what's happening with student mobility in Europe. We have a continent where most of the mobility, or more than 80% of the European mobility of students, is to another European country. And Brexit is displacing over 100,000 European students. Yeah. So what is happening on the back of that is that it's exerting huge pressures on smaller countries like the Netherlands, possibly Ireland and other European countries with mature higher education systems that can be in high demand. So on one hand, I'm observing a more limited choice for European students, but on the other hand, I can see the huge vacuum, the lack of European students in the British higher education system is most notable. For example, from a graduate degree outcomes point of view, European students are top achievers. I mean, looking on the student data in terms of degree classifications, some of the EU countries like Scandinavia, but also Denmark, Germany, we've got 85, 87% of those students that graduate with first or upper second. About 16 EU countries, their average degree outcomes are higher than the one of the UK home students. So losing these high achievers in the classroom, I think, is devastating on any university in the UK. Not having their input into the classroom is most devastating for the international experience of the home students. But the quality of education, I think, is hugely impacted because of that. So this is at kind of at classroom level. At a research level, is probably just as bad, because over the past year we've seen something like 1,200 fewer PhD entrants into UK research degree programs. And these are the students that occupy mainly STEM areas. And this is the level where we're seeing that more than half of the doctorates are basically from outside the UK. And this is where it's really hitting the system, I think, very, very hard, because their absence is notable. And we are all poorer because of it.
Indeed. Yeah. Would you agree with that, Conor? You know, that because of Brexit? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think there's other, I mean, it's not just, you can see that when you put up real barriers or even perceived barriers for students, it has an impact. I mean, you know, one good example, it goes back some time, but after 9/11, the US with Homeland Security brought in very strict visa measures, and their numbers of Chinese, South Korean and Indian students at PhD level all dropped across the board by over 20%. So any kind of impacts like that becomes very negative. Another part of it is, of course, because of the UK's non-association with the Horizon 100 billion programme, they have dropped. They're still involved in a peripheral sense, but they used to be the lead country in terms of numbers of grants won. That has dropped significantly. They're well down now, behind Germany, France and Italy. And what that means, of course, there's less money, there's less opportunity, there's less funding for PhDs from abroad.
Yeah, the Irish universities are suffering as well because of the collapse of collaboration with British universities. Yeah. I might ask you about just a question of other geopolitical decisions that are coming or that we see on the horizon. Will they impact as well on student mobility?
Can I just pick on this one, because we've got huge issues with the relations with China.
Yeah.
Again, in the research space, I mean, the most collaborations are between UK, EU countries, but also with China. In the research space, EU and Chinese doctorates, about 41% of the PhD students in the UK. So the combined effect is paramount. And we know that, Ian, you mentioned areas like AI and other technology-related areas can be quite tricky if universities are recruiting researchers from China, especially if they're government-funded scholars. They'll be attracting much higher scrutiny, but we know that the best selection of candidates comes through the government-funded programs. And if there is some kind of limit on government-funded scholars, then we are limiting the best possible candidates for STEM areas. And in the longer term, this can cause huge problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John.
So first of all, I just want to start by going back to the previous question about mobility, because I do think there is something, given that this is a European summit, I think it's really always important also what makes us really distinctive here in Europe. And I do think that this point about the mobility within Europe is extraordinary. What we've seen in the last few years in terms of the growth of European university alliances is quite spectacular in the sense that we now have the growth of new models and new modes of collaboration that are still very much in the early days. But it seems to me that for the first time, Europe is really experimenting with this huge advantage of cross-border mobility that really makes it quite distinctive. And as I said, we're only at the beginning of this, but I do think it's incontestable that no matter how difficult this is to make work in practice, we are growing much more closely together as countries and universities across different countries and spaces.
Is this cross-border mobility reducing the brain drain from Europe to American universities or other universities?
I think it's way too early to tell. I don't think I haven't seen any figures to that, either for or against. But I do think what it is doing is that it increases the mobility flows in short-term, long-term abilities between different parts of Europe. So because you were starting with this concern about what happens when the UK falls away. Now I still hope that we find ways to increase mobility between the UK and other parts of Europe, but I also think we will see more of intra-European mobility that is more evenly balanced.
Yeah, okay.
It's probably more to say about brain circulation in that space. And Ian mentioned the European alliances rather than brain drain from one direction towards others.
Within Europe, though.
within Europe.
But it's also about pedagogical innovation, I think, because with this come new forms and new modes of circulation, and that really then means that each of these alliances really has to work through what it actually means for their pedagogies, and in the long term, how they can also integrate some of those pedagogies into their main ways of doing things. So as I said, we're only at the beginning of those processes yet, but if you were looking for a positive as a signal for something that's really happening in Europe in terms of mobility, that's what I would point to.
Yeah, all of these developments are very welcome, I think. But are the qualifications frameworks at a European level, are they robust enough? Is there sufficient emphasis on quality assurance across all of the European frameworks?
Yes, if I may comment on this, I would say yes. Of course, we are not, let's say, at the end of the process, but I will follow this positive note on, let's say, saying that we achieved a lot in almost 30 years of work of integration in European countries, of harmonization of higher education system, building common understanding. Today it's easier for students to move within Europe to study or to work. So we should say this and to deserve the merit to people that worked on this before us. Of course, if we look this in a, let's say, chronological perspective, we started actually with qualification framework. So comparing qualification, try to harmonize qualification. Then it came, of course, together with recognition. And then now, in a sense, the most young is quality assurance, so to harmonize also quality assurance framework in Europe. And these three are the three key pillars. And of course, on this, there is a lot to do. And also another point is looking how to internationalize quality assurance, because we are also looking to these new models of higher education institution, of pedagogy, so we need also new models of, let's say, international exchange. But we could say that, yes, I mean, we achieved some results, and I mean, other regions are looking also to what we did and what we are doing to get inspiration.
Yeah. Just in that connection, the growth of micro-credentials is, I think, very welcome. But do they pose challenges for qualifications frameworks, particularly if they're provided by private providers, which seems to be is increasingly the case? The integration of those micro-credentials from private providers into national systems, is that a challenge?
I think it's a constructive challenge. We've seen, again, during the pandemic, what is done is normalizing online learning and online delivery of courses. Yeah. And with this huge liberalization of learning that has taken place, we have seen an explosion of micro-credentials and demand for those. I guess the tension is around recognition. So if various courses are delivered by universities, they have to be accredited. If they're delivered by private companies, then the same requirements probably are not quite applied. But I think the constructive competition there is to deliver work-ready courses or relevant courses that are sought after by employers. And at the end of the day, it's the labour market that will dictate the courses that will be successful and those that will probably have to adapt to survive.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, I think this poses a fundamental question, irrespective of whether these are private providers or whether these are European university alliances and so forth. How do we as institutions recognize the flexibility that's increasing, that's got to increase, and the ideas that come with that? How do we make those, so do we make those fit the boxes that we've created for our internal processes? Or, in which case, you end up with the lowest common denominator for everything? Or can we actually find ways to challenge ourselves as institutions to really go with it and really take on those forms of innovation and really allow them to also innovate other parts of the organizations?
I think if universities don't do it, the private providers will certainly be innovative. Yeah.
If I may complement, what we are seeing is the shifting concept of qualification. If you think about the language, the lexicon, we were used to speak about qualification, and now we hear more and more credential. That is a broader concept. So, and this shifting concept of qualification, of course, is building upon of these 30 years of common work in Europe. So we see more and more that the focus is not only on a bachelor, master, and PhD, but on all the pieces of learning. And in a sense, this is really the success of the student-centered approach, that at the end of the day, the focus is on knowledge, skills of the students. So if the focus is on knowledge and skills, we should be able to recognize them in whatever form they've been acquired. So in the micro-credential discussion, there is also this line that try to, let's say, see the micro-credential as a way to formalize a lot of lifelong learning, different form of learning, alternative providers, training, to, let's say, put this in a kind of recognizable wall to make it more understandable, and also not to let people study again what they already know. And in this there is quite a strong potential, but of course the challenges are many. Quality education, first of all.
Well, yeah, for all, yeah, obviously.
For all.
Yeah, the question of refugees came up. It's obviously desirable that there's better provision for refugees worldwide in terms of higher education. Is that just the responsibility of the universities? I mean, should governments play a much more active part in funding and so forth and supports for refugees in terms of higher, going on to university? Yeah, obviously, yeah. Okay.
There is something to be said about aid budgets. I think most of the foreign aid, is spent on ensuring the well-being and safety of refugees. I can't remember the exact statistics, but I think we're talking about very small percentage that is spent on education.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind that about 50–60% of the refugees are children, I think there is an argument that has to be made about supporting the education needs of growing
within that
refugee
aid
population.
budget, yeah. What I might do is I might invite one or two contributions from the floor. If you wouldn't mind standing up and giving us your name, please, and tell us where you're from. And would you like to make an observation or ask the panel a question? You're not normally that quiet in your lecture halls, I'd say. Yes, okay, thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Marta Žuvić, I come from University of Rijeka. Hello everyone, my name is Marta Žuvić, coming from University of Rijeka, Vice President for Students and Studies, Croatia, European Union. I was thinking about this general statement that we usually make about what is education about, and it's empowering students to access their full potential individually. On the other hand, a lot of experts say that among transversal skills that we need to build for future is in our students is resilience and tolerance to insecurity. So I would like to know what are your thinking or ideas, how do higher education institutions approach this issue? Or how do we organize higher education in terms to succeed in building those competencies for the future?
Big challenge. Anybody like to take that up? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to take it up from the point of view of, say, of doctoral candidates, because they move from what you might call a very cozy environment of learning to suddenly being put into a position where they have to perform original research, which can be very, very challenging, because if you're in the lab, your experiment doesn't work, you have to persist again and again and again. And in a way, that process, if properly supported, and I think this is a really important point, if properly mentored, can be highly valuable to those graduates then afterwards, because they can come out at the end knowing that they can succeed in the face of adversity, to get their data, to write a thesis, to do all of these things. So I think, yes, it's in the system. Perhaps it should be better recognized and named, rather than we know it happens like that, but the student should also learn that as well, I think, to self-recognize that this is part of their PhD. It's part of the process to actually have a hard time, let's say, for part of it, but come out the other end with a really positive experience.
Is this where a micro-credential would be very useful?
Well, I think perhaps, but that's a really interesting point, because traditionally the PhD was very much the academic apprenticeship. You went in, you hung around with your supervisor for as long as possible to get your PhD. The idea of structural doctoral programs now with integrated learning modules, which actually have credits associated with them, has been a real advantage, because certainly it increases the student's ability then, or the doctoral candidate's ability, to work as a researcher in the lab, to research the literature, etc., to learn about research ethics, to learn about how to write scientific articles. And I think, yes, and these have become effectively micro-credentials for those students. But I think as well, it's helping them recognize whether you would have I don't think you would have necessarily a micro-credential in resilience, but you certainly could have a module which would talk about these aspects of the doctorate, of the challenges that people will face, of the loneliness in many cases, and the very high levels of stress that students doing their PhD face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry.
Just quickly, I think so. A lot of that change, to my mind, is already happening, in the sense that my observation is that universities are more and more really taking up very consciously their regional role, their role as within the ecosystem of companies, but also of society, and embracing things like sustainable development goals in their locales. And so then the fundamental question is, how do you bring students, how do you bring education into that? And so my answer to that would be, fine, if you want to create a microcredit, that's fine, microcredential. But actually, the key is about mainstreaming this in your educational activity through the educational provision in the different kinds of subjects as appropriate to these subjects. Right. So many universities are now really integrating sustainable development goals in their teaching. And the question then is, how do you do it well so that you don't lose the educational depth, but you're still connected to your local environment? And there are so many opportunities that I think universities up and down Europe are doing extremely well and really imaginatively.
Anybody else like to ask a question? Right, yeah, over. I think. Yep. Right, there's somebody over here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I'm from Lund University in Sweden. I'm thinking about what you said about the EU students in the classroom. Obviously, nowadays, then those students are facing a different choice when deciding where to study, because perhaps the normal route that they may have considered before of going to the UK is less viable for them. But at my university, we're actually seeing a slight downturn at the moment in terms of, for example, Dutch students, German students, etc. I wondered if you all had any thoughts on or insights into the trends in terms of motivations or priorities for those students now when they're facing this new choice of where to study. Thank you.
Question?
That's an excellent question, Rebecca. Thank you. And it's quite a difficult one as well, because it's intricately related to students' motivation and decision-making processes. The area that I've been observing with huge interest is the space that Chiara touched on, the mobility of programs and transnational education. And this is where I'm seeing a huge growth in demand in students taking courses, foreign degrees, either in their home country or in another European country. And often they'll be doing a foreign course alongside their main course of study. So students doing possibly 2 degrees or 2 courses at the same time. One can be done online, and or as a part of the program that they're enrolled in their home university. It's a difficult one to measure because, for example, in the UK, I can see on the Higher Education Statistics Agency records that there is a huge interest and uptake a few K degrees in Europe on one hand, but on the other hand, on the supply side, we are seeing a significant issues of UK universities engaging with their European counterparts because of problems we discussed, such as Brexit and CIMEA. So in terms of degree mobility, there is a surge in interest, and more students are signing up for courses like that. What obviously I don't quite know is how other programs across Europe are faring, whether Dutch universities teaching degrees overseas, whether there is increase, simply because there isn't a systematic data collection. So we can only measure the things that we are measuring, basically. Everything else is slightly difficult to capture. But I think this mindset of thinking globally within your own area or locality is becoming bigger and bigger, and I'm quite heartened to see this growth in demand for taking up courses that are basically delivered not from the local university, but it can be from anywhere in the world.
Sorry, did you want to come in there?
Can I just connect this to an earlier point? Bear with me about the connection. There is a logic to that, about the refugees that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether we in Europe also, because I was saying earlier that we need to think about what is specific to Europe, but I also think that it's also about how Europe can really relate itself to the rest of the world in maybe different or new and important ways. And I do think there is something really about thinking about developing international global partnerships in a really different way, in a way that are really much more long-term and based and equitable. And I was thinking about this in terms of refugees. So I think it's hugely important for all of us to really think about how we can cater for refugees and displaced people. And what that will very often mean, and most often mean, is that we will support refugees and displaced people where they are, and because only the tiniest minority of them come here. But if we're going to do that seriously, it doesn't just require government funding. I think it also really requires local partners. And I think for that we need really also to have the humility to have conversations with universities in Africa, parts of Asia, etc., to really work with them, to really, first of all, really understand their needs and understand how they can best and how we can best work together in partnership. And I think, so to my mind, what we can bring as universities is exactly about this rethinking of global relations and partnerships, and for the government and then to really find ways to support that.
Yeah, because student mobility is not just about those who can afford it. Those who can't afford to be mobile need supports, but not just from outside of Europe, or refugees or displaced people, but also internally. I mean, every country has its own disadvantaged groups who cannot avail of student mobility.
If I may, let's say, continue to comment on this point, and also linking this to the question on secondary school. So we have a link also to the entry qualification to higher education. This tendency that Janet and Jan highlighted, it's true, it's very true, and it's true also for final school leaving qualification, because more and more local students and local parents decide to send their children in international schools, because they see this international final school leaving qualification as a gateway, as an entry, let's say, highway to get access in the most prestigious universities. So this point of internationalization at home, how we relate this relation among local education and the globe, and of course how we do ensure that this education is quality. Again, who quality assured? If I have a pure international institution, who is responsible for the quality of this institution? It's not the state, of course, it's not the national authority. So who takes care of all these elements? So those are all interesting challenges related to this changing model of cooperation at the global scale, at higher education level, but also at the school level. And we also see that there is an effort on regulatory framework. Just entered into force the Global Convention on Recognition of Qualification. That is exactly an effort to have a kind of overarching framework to support inter-regional mobility. exactly of degrees.
Thank you, that's very, very useful intervention. We have a few minutes left, and I'm just reflecting that I think we've avoided a word that comes up usually in discussions about universities, crisis. I don't think anybody has mentioned a crisis, although I think in the next session you're going to be told how to avoid them or how to deal with them. But I'd like to finish on a slightly optimistic note. So what I might do is ask each of you to make one or two brief observations about why we should be optimistic or very pleased with what's happened with the state of higher education in Europe. Can I start with you, Chiara? Yeah.
Yes, very quickly. I mean, as I said, we built Europe. I mean, almost 25 years ago in the Bologna Declaration, there was this sentence that ministers in charge of higher education were committed to build a Europe of knowledge. Almost 25 years after, well, we have a still long way in front of us, but we can say that we achieved something. We have this harmonization of higher education system, recognition scheme, quality assurance scheme, so we can trust each other, and it's easier for a student compared to 20 years or 30 years ago to move freely for study or for work in Europe.
Very good.
Well, I'm personally a very strong proponent of mobility. I did my PhD in Italy. I was a researcher in Scotland, in Germany and Belgium. And I think it's such a valuable part of one's career, not just in terms of the learning, but also the cultural experience. I think that could never be underestimated, how much one learns through that. I think now I am very optimistic because very soon there will be a new charter for researchers published in Europe, and this is going to bring in new aspects for researchers, aspects around open science, open data, around greater integrity in research itself, and also new means of research assessment, of having better ways to recognize what people do in their assessment. But I think one of the futures in mobility is not just in transnational, but it will also be intersectoral, interdisciplinary, greater focus to bring more of the talent of researchers into the workplace.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Conor's been saying. So I represent a number of universities in Europe, and I've done this for 7 years. And when I look at how the discussion has been transformed within the past 7 years, we are discussing exactly these kinds of issues and many other issues around education much, much more intensively across Europe than we did 7 years ago. And the change has really been palpable. And we need to continue. We need to recognize that it's not just about formal documents, but the point about those documents is also about the cultural shift that they need to bring about. So that's a real cause for optimism. The other cause for optimism is a conditional one, which is that in Europe we are still really talking on the whole about a publicly regulated educational system. And that comes with challenges when we think about AI. I mean, it's not for nothing that the Booking.com creates effectively its own graduate programs. So we need to really be very mindful of the changes happening, but at the same time, I think if we can really embrace all the changes around us with the advantages that we have of being public universities that do not have to speak to any interest except for the interests of science and of our students, that's, I think, the huge optimism that we can have, and I hope that we'll do that.
Okay, very good. Final word to you, Janet. Yeah.
What makes me optimistic is that we are seeing a growth in mobility in all its shapes. And this is student mobility, mobility of programs, mobility of research, mobility of institutions. And this has gone hand in hand with a liberalization of the regulatory frameworks for transnational education or foreign education provision in various countries. And slowly, but it's happening, that we are seeing a greater recognition of foreign degrees and qualifications and credentials. So all this as an ecosystem, I think, is leading to a globally looking mindset. And this gives me hope. So I am optimistic.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to draw this to a close. Can I thank you all, Jan, Chiara, Conor and Janet, for a very interesting wide range of comments and suggestions and notes of optimism for the future. So thank you. Give you a round of applause. Yeah.